All right, everybody had a good Dragon Con because this is pretty much the tail end. Everybody's awake. Uh, so I love the fact that we get people in this room on Monday. It's so nice, especially for Dana. Uh, she's been coming here doing talks now for what, like 11, 12 years? Something like that, yeah. So I didn't know this part until I saw it on their slide, so I'll ruin the surprise. But part of this is going to have free will, which is actually a big thing with skeptics, so that's kind of cool. Um, I will let you take over and do your presentation. This is Dave and Dana Bevan. If you come to this track, you should know who she is. If not, um, I don't know who you are. Oh, especially if you're here on a Monday, you have to know.
So since about 2004, I've been researching why people are transgender, mainly because I'm transgender, and I'm also a scientist, um, and I wanted to know more about it as to whether it was real, what are the causes that make people transgender. And so I'm going to give you an update this today involving the role of free will, which is interesting to a lot of people in the skeptics community. Usually the arguments are centered around philosophy, but today we're going to talk about science and evidence that leads me in the direction that you'll see. First of all, just to introduce myself, I'm a psychologist. And as you can see, I went to some schools. My freshman year, I volunteered to become a psychology major, and Dartmouth College, as you may know, is up in the woods of New Hampshire, and they have ponds and rivers, and along one of the ponds called Occam Pond, as in Occam's razor, they have a cabin which is used for social events. And so I was pleased to be invited as a new psychology major to the cabin where we were having a good time. And it turns out that one of my to become academic grandfathers discovered something called the moon illusion. And the moon illusion is that for a particular day, if you look at the moon on the horizon and you look up at the moon at the zenith, the moon on the horizon appears to be larger. And one of the explanations for this is that you can see the horizon in its customary place in your visual field. Well, the experiment to do that is to turn the horizon upside down. And so one way of doing that was witnessed. There were about 90 people at this shindig, and all of a sudden they all turned their rear end to the moon and looked between their legs, which turns the horizon upside down to see whether the moon looks different in terms of its size. So there were more surprises along the way, but that got me started. And let's see, as you can see, I've been in and out of academia, but mostly in private industry. And I've written some books on 4 of them on being transgender and what's known about the science. And I was a director on the board of directors of US Path, which is the US correspondent to WPATH, which sets standards of care, medical care for transgender people. And right now I'm concentrating on the American Psychological Association task forces that are involved with trying to get the truth out about transgender kids and so forth. And you can look up my blog posts and podcasts. They're under the rubric of transgender science. So why do we care about transgender causation? The understanding of transgender causation or misunderstanding causes a great deal of problems. The conflation of sex and gender, which you see all the time, makes something sleazy about being transgender and helps to, as we've seen recently, all the legislation that causes transgender people to lose some of their rights. It sometimes is blamed, being transgender is blamed on improper child rearing, which is parents have enough to deal with, but it blames them. And it causes support for what's called reparative or conversion therapy, which is damaging to children and adults alike, both physically and mentally. If it's being transgender solely due to biology, then it reduces the need for culture change to make them more accepted and tolerated. And if it's just a lifestyle choice, it ignores the genetic gender predisposition, which I'll talk about next. So to give you a definition of it, transgender people are those that don't behave according to the gender assigned at birth. That's usually assigned by sex, which is assigned by inspection of external genitalia. And those criteria are set by culture, not by the transgender person. In our culture, this is based entirely on that, but in other cultures it's not, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. So transgender people tend to be cultural outlaws because they don't fit into the culture because of their biology. So what I've been working on is a cascade of factors, causative factors. I've talked about some of these before, and the first four, and I'll give you an update on those. And then to that wasn't good enough. I needed to get some completion to get to the actual behavior, and that's where free will comes in. So the first causative factor, is genetic predisposition. They're based on genetics. It's more likely that people will be transgender. If you look at identical twins, about 50% of the time, if one of them is transgender, then the other will be. There's a lot of good twin data out there because many countries keep records of twins because of looking at this particular thing about DNA. Then more recently, they did a genome-wide scan of transgender people versus non-transgender people and discovered about 450 genes that had markers on them that would point to a predisposition, a genetic predisposition. I should say that to put that in context, there are about 100,000 genes in the genome, human genome, and we don't. In a lot of cases, they work in networks, not in single genes. So no one's looking for a gene that's a transgender gene or a gay gene. Well, maybe there are some people that in the latter category, but by and large, it's now accepted that genes work in combination with one another in networks to produce various traits. And in particular now they're discovering that there are about 5,000 genes that cause the anatomical traits of sex. We don't have a full understanding of that either, and so we don't know what the overlap is. We do know that being transgender tends to run in families. We know about the Wachowski brothers who became the Wachowski sisters. They are not identical twins. They are non-identical siblings, but it does tend to run in families, although the exact genealogical lineage hasn't been figured out yet. That's something I'm concerned with. And there are markers for being transgender. Transgender people tend to be less right-handed than other people. You can see Caitlyn Jenner throwing, or in the Olympics throwing, that's not a reverse image. You can see her throwing the javelin and also the shot, and I think also the discus, which is part of the decathlon, with her left hand. And there have been famous athletes, transgender athletes, that do things with their left hand. It doesn't mean that you are totally left-handed or totally right-handed. It just means handedness means that you do more things with one hand versus the other. For example, I write with my right hand, but I swing a baseball bat and a golf club from the left-hand side of the plate. And of course, there are a lot of it has been made about there are neuroanatomical differences between transgender people. Those probably are created by DNA during development, but that's not totally nailed down yet. So, example of other genetic behavioral predispositions, like one of them is language. People have the predisposition to acquire language, but which one depends on where they are and what culture they're in. Any case, and handedness, of course, we know has genetic roots. If you have left-handed female and a left-handed male, the odds are about 15% that offspring will also be left-handed. So that there is some genetic proof of that. Sex and gender are not the same thing, as I alluded to earlier. And the proof of that comes in two parts. One is existence of transgender people. They're all over the place, about 1% to 2% of the population. And the other is that if you look at these twin studies that where one is trans and one is not, they're both the same sex in all the cases that they've looked at. So although the sex is the same, the gender is not. So there is a strong correlation between sex and gender, but as we know, that could be separate. That doesn't prove causation. The genes that produce, all of the genes that produce sex may or may not be involved with those producing gender. And the second factor is epigenetics. Epigenetics is a relatively new term. It refers to things that change DNA or change how it's expressed through RNA to the rest of the body. And epigenetics can block various traits. I think the most publicized one is the BRCA genes that predispose people for breast cancer. Those are not always expressed, and so therefore you can have that marker, but which should make you more vigilant about breast cancer, but it doesn't always occur. So the epigenetics can block genetic expression. You can see there that those two kids on the laps of the parents, those are identical twins, although they look quite different. There's a cultural factor. And as I said, Western culture is unique. We're binary, that is, we have two categories. It's cisgender, and people are wedded between their sex and their gender, but that doesn't apply to transgender people. And it's relatively inflexible, as we've seen from the rejection and nastiness expressed against transgender people. And show you some other cultures. These are some examples. There are probably, in my books, I have about 200. And these are cultures or subcultures that have third and fourth and even fifth genders. They don't just have masculine and feminine genders. They have people born with male sex who act in what you might consider to be a feminine way for the third gender. And the fourth gender is just the opposite, those born female who act in a masculine way. And then there's even one that's a fifth gender, which could be either male or female, but is in that particular culture, in Indonesia, is linked entirely to spirituality. So you can see that the first two, of course, are representative of the American Indians, and I use that term correctly because one of my friends was a guy named Ken Dollarhide, who was an American Plains Indian, and he preferred that term as opposed to Native Americans. So those are, the Zuni and the Navajo are pretty well visible. The Zapotec are becoming more visible. There's been a recent set of articles in magazines and on YouTube about the Zapotec. They are at the very far south of Mexico and are a Native American Indian tribe. And they've had a third gender for as long as their cultures have been going on. Interesting about that one is that it's blessed by the Catholic Church twice a year in various festivals. The Hira in India, Pakistan, they're the most numerous third gender, probably. Estimates range between hundreds of thousands and a million. And they've gained some rights in India in terms of having a third gender category on their identification. And you can see some of these others. The Maori, I have that as being, and the Mahu from the South Pacific, from Tahiti, I have them as being historical because both of them were displaced by the atom bomb test during World War II, and they've lost a great deal of their original behaviors. And then, yeah, you can see and then in the back of in the Pope's backyard in Naples, there's the Feminello, which is our third gender category. So this gives you a flavor for what the rest of the world looks like and what other gender systems look like. So you can't be transgender unless you know something about gender. And kids learn gender pretty easily. It's in their face from almost from the time they come home. Even before they come home from the hospital, they're wearing pink or blue. And their parents tell them all about gender, and they see people with different genders and how they dress and how they comport themselves. So there are about two peaks for realization when kids are transgender. One's around 4 or 5, and then more recently, in early puberty, we've been playing catch up with kids who had no treatment available, and now in early puberty are declaring that they're transgender or might be transgender. And there have been recent studies that show that trans children are not confused about their gender. They know perfectly well about different genders, and they just are express themselves in one or the other or a mixture of the two. But they're not confused at all, which you hear all the time that, well, that kids are just confused. So that brings us to the need for a fifth factor, because we're not yet there to transgender behavior, where the groundwork has been laid by the first 4 factors. And what's been amazing to me as I experience transgender community is transgender people can postpone their gender expression for long periods of time. I did for about 45 years. Some of them are part-time, some of them go for brief periods of time. One of my friends is now out in Arizona. She's been out there on the West Coast for 45 days and is a trans person, and nobody seems to care. So she's having a good time driving around in the Western United States. But when she comes back, she'll resume her now part-time role as being cisgender. So why do they postpone it? Well, for me, I had a family, I had a career. My career depended on having a security clearance, and until 1991, I couldn't even talk to anyone about, i.e. a mental health professional, about being transgender. So I was deep in the closet for quite a long time. Most transgender people are not out, they're not transitioning. In 2001, the estimate was about 48,000 had transitioned. There are somewhere in the order of 1 to 2 million in the US, most of which are still in the closet. I can't count more than a few 100,000 who have actually transitioned, but there are more than that who are living full time. So what you see is the tip of the iceberg in terms of visible transgender people. So most people don't do what's called transgender genital plastic surgery, in spite of the news reports. That's pretty rare, but does happen. So the 4 factors, as I said, that I've looked at, which represent a cascade of factors leading to transgender behavior, it doesn't explain the decision processes that lead from those basic 4 factors causative factors. So that brings me to free will. Clearly, people are not being transgender when they have all those factors, those 4 factors in place. And why not? And what's the decision process that goes on to keep them from expressing their transgender behavior or to allow them to express their transgender behavior? So that's in the last year or so, that's mainly what I've been looking at. It brings me closer to the end game, if you will. And free will is inextricably, what I learned was, I went back and started looking at all the philosophers that have talked about free will for about the last 3,000 years. And that's what I mean, they've talked about this. And I've tried to weigh it in on what's really known from a science point of view, and what's really going on here. And we know that it appears that consciousness and free will are involved with these kinds of decisions. So I started looking at sources closer to scientific sources that might give me some clues. One of the guys that's done the most on consciousness is Julian Jaynes. His problem was he was trying to figure out when consciousness emerged in the human family. The notion being is that consciousness is a latecomer rather than early in the human evolution. And so there's some good stuff there, some of which I'll talk about. There's a guy named Dennett who's probably written more and been on TV more than anybody else in terms of free will. His sources are dated. I've read his books, and the most I can glean from them is that somehow representations involved with consciousness, that somehow the objective real world is represented in consciousness, but still valuable stuff. Then there's Judith Gentner, who explains how we use words to improve our concepts, and we do that through metaphors. We try, as information comes in, we classify it verbally, and that helps us when it comes down to making decisions or doing analysis. And so there's a very rich database of how metaphor and analogies, if you will, affect our thinking. And it's objective data. I mean, it's empirical results. Then there's a guy named Klein. It turns out that there are people interested in decision-making include the U.S. military. Our military tends to delegate responsibility and authority down to a lower level and than other militaries, and therefore they school military people on how to make decisions. And of course, they want to know what the right way to do it is. And Klein's been studying how, and his people have been studying about what's called naturalistic decision making. How do people make those conscious decisions, and how should they make those conscious decisions in the correct way to come out with good ones. And then there's Rand, that's Ayn Rand. Yes, that Ayn Rand, that everybody got Ayn Randed when they were in college, I guess. But that's not original. Bob Dylan wrote a song that included that. He's been Ayn Randed. Anyway, she agrees with a lot of these guys in terms of what she calls her epistemology, which is way of knowing. How do we know things? And her emphasis is on attention and focus on incoming stimuli, that we can voluntarily change our focus and voluntarily label that information and conceptualize it. There's no empirical data there, but it does seem to be consistent with some of the other folks. Then there's David Kelly, who's a Rand aficionado. He's a philosopher, and actually he's been helping me more recently with these issues. So we're in correspondence with one another. Then there's Libet, or Libet, not how you, he's French, so I have no idea how you pronounce his name. And he and others have been doing work with trying to take EEGs and MRIs at the moment of decision to see where and how the brain operates, and so on. So there is some sources of data that evidence and theories which can be tested, as opposed to a lot of the philosophical theories are too vague to be tested. So that's where I've been wading in, and I'll give you a progress report. So the question is, how do people really decide using conscious decision making? And there appears to be some answers now. So the debate, the philosophical debate, comes over determinism versus free will, which means determinism simply means that everything is, all your behaviors are motivated by prior causes. And so the hardcore determinists say there's no such thing as free will. But of course, our entire judicial system's predicated that people have free will and can make decisions whether to commit crimes or injure other people. So there's some tension there as to what's going on. I don't want to take the philosophical debate. I just want to understand how the role of free will and determinism, how they play together. So starting with, Julian Jaynes did a good job in his book about, first we needed to find what consciousness is, so let's define what it's not. And there's a lot of behavioral psychology evidence that actually, some of which I actually know about from my schooling, that speaks to this. First of all, it's not reactivity. It's not whether you're knocked out or asleep or in a coma. And it's not the ethereal consciousness that people talk about in terms of any rate. So it's not those things, but it represents only a small piece of how we react to things and how we behave. It's a very small part of our mental activity. Jaynes likens it to using a flashlight in a dark room, that you're only conscious of where you point your light to see. You can't only be conscious of the object that the light is on. And so we tend to think of consciousness as being this continuous interplay of things, but it's not. It's very, very focused. Although our brain fools us into thinking that consciousness is continuous, experiments indicate that it's not, that we're not taking all those things into consciousness, that we're not verbalizing them, and we're not, now there are other parts of the brain that may be recording those, which may be useful later, but consciousness, it's not part of consciousness. It's not really necessary for learning. There are various kinds of learning things, like this girl's learning how to ride a bicycle. In fact, being conscious of learning can actually interfere with the learning process. That sometimes particularly motor learning, like in bicycle riding, but it also interferes in other, all the different kinds of learning that psychologists have identified. It's not a copy of the experience. We know about multiple choice tests, where we recognize what the right answer is, rather than having to reconstruct what the right answer is. So it's not, the recognition part is not part of the consciousness. There are other processes involved in recognition. And it's not required for concepts, particularly animals can learn concepts only to a point, and that point is where humans start to use verbal rules of thumb to define the concept. And so only humans can do that, despite what humans are the only ones that really have a good language. There have been experiments with chimps and other animals, but their language facility is far, far less than ours. And it's not necessary for simple decisions. If you take two objects that are about the same size and say which one of them is heavier or lighter, your decision is made before you're even conscious of what, of their poundage or grammage. And that's been known since the 1870s in a place called the Würzburg School, which is where psychology started. So what consciousness is, it's a language-based operation that's emerged in humans. And of course, James was concerned about when that occurred. But it's clearly not an animal operation. It structures the information that comes in, assigns verbal labels to them, and makes use of speech. Now, speech, of course, is a tool, and there's now some good studies about the interaction between speech and real tools, hand tools, for example. So we use it as a tool, using metaphors to create models of the real world in our heads. And those models can be projected into the future, and therefore we can choose between alternative outcomes, alternative choices by their outcomes. And we do use reason and logic and math to check on those, and to the extent that we are precise in our decision making, we will use those tools to make our decisions. And so that's how we do, that's how we actually do decisions. In this, Gary Klein has been working on what's called naturalistic decision making. It's a good time to get a drink of water. And that's the gist of what he's found. So for him, a soldier will have a decision to make, and he creates models in his own head based on the information he's received and chooses. So this has some further ramifications, it has some features. You can stew about a decision like where to go to college or what your career should be. You can keep retasking those models to reflect the objective worlds that you might encounter. You can pre-plan for time-critical decisions, and a lot of experience in that. For example, political issues, how are you going to handle political issues when they come up? You can think through those and come up with a strategy and a decision about what to do. And as I said before, humans appear to be the only species that have an adequate language capability to do this kind of decision making. The best analogy that I can find is what's called a command center. one of the things I did back in 1970s was I took a tour of military command centers around the world. And, you know, you go to the Strategic Air Command and they have floor-to-ceiling, like Dr. Strangelove. They have floor-to-ceiling displays of incoming or outgoing aircraft. And even the military, even the civilians have command centers now for, you know, Norfolk and Southern has a big command center that where all the trains are routed and monitored. So a command center takes in information, categorizes it, verbalizes it, and makes it available in real-world models. In the case of a lot of these, they're maps, and spatialization is one of the features of consciousness in terms of categorization. So that's the best analogy I can do. But it's but the brain works as a whole. So that kind of operation is virtual. It's not, it can't point to one place in the brain. Now, with regard to transgender people, the obvious choice is whether they should express their transgender behavior or not, and the process we just talked about can apply there to what they're going to do in the future. Again, they are models of objective reality that are in their head, either by the benefits of expressing transgender behavior or rejection and negative effects. So to put a bow on it, there are substrates, which are the first four causal factors in transgender behavior. And James would say they form aptic structures, which are a combination of genetics and experience. Aptic only means that you're apt to do those behaviors. But it applies here, I think. And those are factors that are obvious, I guess, if you look at them. But then the one that's not so obvious and has a unique characteristic is not an aptic structure. Although it rides on top of the structures in the brain, it's self-generated and is the final fifth factor, causal factor. So where does that leave us from a philosophical point of view? I'll leave that to the philosophers to thrash out, but it appears to me that that free will is, in fact, a causal factor in behavior. Whether you want to classify it as deterministic or not is probably a matter of taste. So here is, if you want to get in touch with me, there's my email address. And here are the 4 books I've written. The fifth factor in transgender behavior is not included in those yet. So I have some work to do some documentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bevan. It's always a pleasure to have you here. So we have a microphone here set up in the aisle. Please don't touch it. It is magic mic, and it will come to you. So you mentioned multiple cultures have more than 2 genders, and some of them are historical. So can you talk about the trajectories of those designations? Are they tending to become more not fracture, that's not right. Like more numerous, or are they condensing into a more Westernly traditional?
Western
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Western culture, in a lot of different ways, tends to degrade those cultures. Talking to the mic, please. Oh, talking to the mic. Yeah. Yeah, it tends to degrade those cultures. Things like early on missionaries coming to the Polynesian islands and converting not just Polynesia but other places. Then there, as I alluded to earlier, the atom bomb tests displaced large numbers of South Pacific people. And then just Western culture in general tends to be more attractive than some native culture. Yeah, it's hard to, it's just part of the natural evolution of when cultures get exposed to other behaviors, whether they adopt them or not.
So are the traditional cultures able to reassert the traditional roles, many though they may be?
In some cases, they've been trying, like the Maori in New Zealand. They've been trying to reinstitute their culture or make it more easy for them. And they are recognized by various countries. I think they are the most proactive in terms of reconstructing, but most governments don't like. They like uniformity, and
fewer check boxes on the list.
Yeah, they don't like outliers.
Do you find it more common in the societies that have a more robust education system that you start to condense into smaller numbers, or I mean, like, I don't know how to ask the question really. Like if you have a less regimented like education system, do they tend to persist? The multiple genders, do they tend to persist in the community, like as an accepted form of self-expression? Or
well, where Western educational systems have encroached, they tend to those cultures tend to disappear. Yeah. Okay. But there's one of the things I ran into is educational philosophy. Mm-hmm. Even in Western philosophy, there's a wide variety of different cultures that tend to be either for or against these third and fourth gender categories.
Do they tend to be pretty equanimous and that's not the right word. What's the word? Equitable, like more equitable in their social rights and distribution of assets and such?
Yeah, there was a Napoleonic Code back in the late 1800s, which recognized and allowed for homosexuals to be legalized, and then and that applied in Germany and France, and then during the 30s, of course, you saw the book burnings. Well, those were book burnings about sex and gender in Magnus Hirschfeld's laboratory. So that era of good feeling evaporated.
Okay, that's very sad. Yeah, we're not a fan of them. I'm not a fan of the Nazis. Can you? So we do have this microphone here. We're happy to entertain any other questions. I'll tell you, I have a friend who was here this weekend, and I'm just going to brag on DragonCon for a minute. That when it was the first trip to DragonCon, and this person has an offspring who is now non-binary, and I'm not clear that this non-binary person is having a great deal of acceptance in their home state, and I'm really hoping that they'll come back and enjoy the inclusivity and the open and acceptance of DragonCon. I'm always impressed at how open and how accepting DragonCon is. So thanks y'all for that, for sure. So, any questions at all? Dr. Bevans, any other shameless plugs? I saw that you had your books up there. We certainly love having you here.
Well, yeah, I'm going to continue on. There are other aspects, and I should explain. There's just a flood of quote unquote scientific studies about transgender behavior, most of which are total rubbish. So I spent a large amount of my time looking at a study to see if it has any bearing or not. And by and large, they don't. They're typically things about if you're a mental health professional, how should you talk to a transgender person, which is valuable, but it isn't basic science, which is what I'm looking for.
Well, I suspect that there's a lot of problems with the medical community still learning how to talk without offense, because even though we all genuinely want to take care of folks, we're still humans, and we make cognitive errors all the time. And so
Sure.
I know I had to be educated on how to talk to
Yes.
my patients who are transgender. I had a very sad, I'm going to tell a personal anecdote if y'all don't mind. Y'all okay with that? So I had a patient who had sprained an ankle, the person's own personal ankle, and it was it was not on the chart. The person was listed with the birth gender, but the person was clearly presenting in a fashion that made turns out made him like they couldn't he couldn't designate what his preferred gender was. And even though he had not begun to chemically transition, he was still listed as female in the medical chart. Now, lots of the medical software is changing. We just got a new system that is now allowing people to designate their gender preference. Anyway, but because this person needed an X-ray, radiology required a pregnancy test. And so I did not have that information yet, that this was the person's preferred gender. So I actually had to ask the person what his preference was. And I see here you're presenting very masculinely, and I would like very much to, and the radiologist is going to ask me about, I thought that he was male. I mean, he looked male, and I thought there was a mistake. And I said, are you transitioning? And he said, can I still get taken care of if I am? And I was so sad that was the first thought that came to his mind. And I was like, oh my God, I really hope he wouldn't think that about me. But I had to explain, no, this is something, radiology is going to ask me to get a pregnancy test if you're going to get an X-ray. And I can tell them to go screw themselves, or I can tell them, whatever. And I apologize. I said, I'm so sorry that that's the first thought that comes to your mind. Of course, you can always get care here. And I've had to, re-educate nurses and stuff, because there's sometimes the patient is starting to present in their gender, but and I apologize if I make mistakes. I don't mean to, but they may or may not have begun chemical supplementation at that point, but may still have characteristics of the birth gender. And so the nurses sometimes do have the visual cue. They work off the visual cue without necessarily consulting the chart or me. And so we kind of try to keep each other honest and make sure that people are using preferred, because I work in a rural department. So maybe I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ramble. But
well, in fairness to medical doctors in particular, the surveys show that doctors in medical school get about 4 hours of LGBT instruction.
That's a lot more than I got. I got none. Yeah, I got none. Right. I had to learn that. I had to learn it from podcasts.
That's an improvement.
And from other folks who have been through the process.
Yeah.
My patients have taught me.
And so there's a big gap even among mental health professionals as to what's going on. Now, in my last book, I wrote that specifically for providers, and I give them 13 rules for how to address transgender people. And
I'm buying that. You have it. I'm gonna buy it right now.
Yeah, I'll send you one. Yeah. But anyway. It's not like people haven't thought about that. It's just that the information is not out there.
Yeah, and I went to medical school 20-something years, like 30 years, almost 30 years. Oh my God, almost 30 years ago. Ugh. Anyway, so and the acceptance has gone way up, and but even some of my specialty colleagues still struggle. I was at a professional society meeting maybe after Caitlyn Jenner transitioned. I don't remember exactly how long ago that was, and she made a Caitlyn Jenner joke, and the room blew up. It was just appalling. I'm texting, I'm like, her phone blew up. You could hear it buzzing on the dais when she was talking. But anyway, we fixed it. So I see somebody with a question. Are you testing the microphone's metal? There you go.
Oh,
Range of motion. Yeah.
I even know this person.
Hi, I just had a note for Angie.
Oh, please.
You were talking about your patient.
You were one of the people. Thank you so much for correcting me on some things I had wrong. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry, Vanderbilt. Please go ahead.
I'm here for you, Angie. And in that spirit, you made a comment about how you didn't know if your patient was beginning hormonal intervention yet. Many trans people never seek or cannot take hormones, so
Right.
it's not appropriate to use the word yet in that context.
You're absolutely right. Thank you for correcting me.
Right, it's not a contest to see
Right.
how many procedures you can get. And there's no, everybody's goals are different.
You're right.
So.
Thank you for correcting me on that. I appreciate
Yes,
that.
and I did have a question for Dana as well.
Mm-hmm.
You've said throughout this presentation, you've used the term transgender behavior instead of transgender identity, and I wonder if you could elaborate on why you use that particular phrase.
Okay, yeah, there's several reasons. One is that identity has a roots in a psychoanalytic community. Freud started with that word, and Erickson continued with it. And those. Okay, I'm going to make a strong statement now. The psychoanalytic kinds of things are pseudoscience to me because they don't predict behavior and they predict everything. So I tend not to use those kinds of terms. The other is, for a long time, there was a thing in the playbook of mental disorders called gender identity disorder. And so that pathologizes that even further. But mainly the reason I don't use it is that it doesn't tell me anything that I don't already know. Overt behavior tells me a lot. If someone says that they're transgender, that tells me something, but their identity doesn't tell me anything.
Okay. Oh, and I also have had several patients with actual documented mental illnesses who are also transgender.
Oh, yeah.
And that complicates the picture, especially when you're talking to other staff. I have a particular schizophrenic patient who is also transgender, and it's hard to explain to the staff sometimes that the two are not related. They are separate issues.
Right. In fact, in some cases, they've had children, this is out at UCLA, they've had children who have more than one problem. And when they address the gender, their gender difficulties, the other problems sometimes just go away. You know, like
that's an excellent point.
You know, like they're depressed because they're being rejected by people.
Well, of course.
And if they're doing something about changing themselves to make themselves more appealing, then that causes them no longer to be as depressed as they were.
Right, that's an excellent point. Schizophrenia doesn't really usually go away, though.
Right, I should explain there are two kinds of depression. There's the organic kind that you get from genes, probably, and then there's a thing called reactive depression when you get rejected and you feel depressed. The first one can only be treated medically. The second one is a matter of avoiding or getting rid of the rejection.
Thank you so much very much. Oh, we love having you here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We'll see you soon.